Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Dear Podcast. On today's episode, I am going to be talking about how to become the best version of yourself. And just hear me out. No, it's not a TED Talk, even though it kind of sounds like a TED Talk, but just hear me out on this. And I will give you a bit of a backstory on how this episode came together and why I decided to have this as a topic for this week, for this Sunday. So basically a few days ago I was hanging out with a friend and we were just chatting like usual, and then he said something along the lines like, Caroline, you know that some things you say I still think about them. And I was like, huh? Like, what have I said? Because we have had a lot of conversations. So I was like, what do you mean? And then he reminded me of a conversation that we had 2 months prior to this, more or less. And he said that this conversation that we had 2 months ago, sometimes on the days when he doesn't feel like getting out of bed, this conversation gets him out of the bed and he thinks about it and reminds himself of that conversation, and in a way it motivates him. When he said that, I knew exactly what he meant, what conversation he meant. And let me just play out that conversation for you as well, and then take it from there. So kind of 2 months ago we were chatting at work, and then he asked me what is my biggest fear. And I said that my biggest fear was not doing everything that I want to do. And I asked him the same question, obviously, and then he replied with that he's afraid of not reaching his full potential and not becoming the best version of himself. So it is, I feel like our answers, they were fairly similar, but just from a different angle or point of view. After he said that he's afraid of not reaching his full potential and not becoming the best version of himself, I replied, and I remember that quite well because I actually think about that conversation myself. And I replied something along the lines of that your best version of self already exists and you are that best version of yourself, because your best version of yourself is not another person. You are that version, but you just haven't unlocked all the things that the best version of yourself does or how they act, but you can do that. And again, just let me explain here. Basically, if now just take a minute and think about the best version of yourself. If you want, you can pause this episode right now. You can either write it down. Think of your best version of yourself. What do they do? What does their day look like? What's their morning routine? What do they do throughout their day? What's their evening routine? What do they eat? What do they watch? What music do they listen to? Just try to think of that best version of yourself and who they interact with. What are they excited about in their life? Just try to put this little imaginary self on into words. And again, you can pause this episode and write it out, or I will just give you a few minutes not a few minutes, sorry. I will give you a few seconds just to get those thoughts flowing, and then we will take it from there. I hope that you have had just a few seconds to think about it and maybe put it, as I said, into words, or just kind of sort it out in your head. When you look at those things that best version of yourself is doing, the way to become that best version of yourself is to start doing those same things. Because you can't just sit there and be like, oh, my best version of myself, let's say, I mean, again, from my experience, let's say that my best version of myself has a podcast. As I mentioned it before, a podcast is something that I wanted to do for a long time but never did, but here we are now. I realized at some point that even though it's something that I really, really want to do, unless I actually start taking the steps to have a podcast, I will never reach it, because nobody else is gonna do a podcast for me. If I want to have my own podcast, I am the one who has to do it. I have to think what I'm going to talk about, plan it out, record it, upload it, share it. I have to do it because nobody else is going to do it for you. When I'm thinking of that best version of myself who has like a great podcast, this podcast doesn't just happen. You kind of have to grow into it, and the first episodes, they're not going to be perfect anyways. So you have to be okay with also being open to making mistakes, and that's fine, because that's also how you learn the best. And that's just one of the examples. Like, you have to actually put in the work to do something to reach that version of yourself. Or for example, let's say that you want to run a marathon in a year from now. You want to run a marathon. Your best version in a year is the one who runs a marathon. So do you wait the whole year just sitting around and hoping that a year from now you will have the stamina to run a marathon? Or will you start taking the little steps and training yourself for a marathon, preparing to run a marathon? Again, the only person who can actually do that is you, because everybody else around you, they can go on runs and everything. But a year from now, if you're not the one that's preparing for a marathon, you're not going to be able to run it. I mean, I know some people are, like some extremely fit people who can just run a marathon like nothing. But if you actually want to do something, you have to start putting in the work now. And I know it's super, super annoying when things take time to grow and actually come together. Because again, with a marathon running, as just an example, you might start with a 5 minute run or like 1 kilometer run at first, even though the marathon itself, was it 42 kilometers or something? And it's like, I think on average, like 3-4 hours to finish. So if you don't start running with starting from 5 minutes or 1 kilometer or whatever, then how will you actually reach the stamina and the resilience? I don't know if that's the right word, but you know what I'm saying. So you actually have to start putting in the work yourself. And kind of another third example, just so you get what I'm saying. Let's say that you want to become an actress. Like, the best version of yourself is an actress, is a world famous actress. Let's say that's your goal in 5 years, that your best version of yourself. You don't have to put a timeline, kind of like, oh, in 5 years I have to do this, I want to do this, but just set a goal. And if you want to be a, for example, world famous actress or actor, then are you just gonna sit around and wait for people to offer you acting jobs if you, for example, have no experience in it? Or try out different acting classes, taking acting classes, participating in like smaller roles, participating in like advertisements and things like that, and actually pitching yourself for different roles and parts. These things are not actually gonna just fall into your lap, because that best version of yourself has done this whole road. They won't just magically be a world famous actress overnight. They have actually put in the work. Your version of yourself who runs a marathon, they didn't just suddenly one morning wake up and were like, okay, I'm gonna run a marathon today. No, they actually prepared it and actually worked for it. So with that being said, want to look at the things that you maybe wrote down of what the best version of yourself does, or what they eat, or what their morning routine looks like. You have to start embodying that version. For example, if your best version of yourself, if they have breakfast every morning, or if they have a well-balanced breakfast every morning, you can start taking the steps now to reach that version of yourself. If the best version of yourself, for example, does yoga every day, again, example from personal life or from my life, I remember, and it wasn't really necessary, like my best self is doing yoga, but I was like, I want to be the person who does yoga every morning. And that was a thought that I had kind of 4 years ago. But I was like, oh, I can't do yoga because yoga is only for skinny people. I actually thought that. And I was like, I'm not like flexible enough for yoga. And I'm not a yoga type person. And for the longest time, I convinced myself that I am not built for yoga, even though there's literally no shape or size for doing yoga, but whatever. But then I started practicing yoga. I started doing 10 minutes every day. For the first 1 or 2 years, I only did max 10 to 15 minute classes from YouTube, sometimes even like 20 minutes if I was pushing myself. And I was like, that is my limit. I guess I will never be able to do a yoga that's half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour. I was putting those limits on myself, even though I was thinking that I really wish I could be the person who does longer yoga sessions as well. And now, kind of 3-4 years fast forwarding to today, I am able to do longer yoga sessions. I can do them for 1 hour and I can keep my focus. I can do harder yogas, like intermediate ones that I once thought that I'm never able to do, because I was like, I don't have the balance, I don't have this, I don't have that. It is all something that I can actually work on. And now looking back, I'm like, I was just lying to myself and demotivating myself with the thoughts of like, oh, I'm not flexible enough, I'm not this enough, I'm not that enough. But all I had to do was start. And now, as I said, I can do more longer yogas. I may not be able to do all the poses and everything, but I know that I'm trying, and that's already one step forward for me. And so for now, when you know what the best version of yourself is doing or how they're acting or what they're doing, you can start laying the foundation now. As I said, with the morning routine kind of a thing, if you start acting like the best version of yourself, you will eventually, it will become naturally to you. Again, from my yoga example, I don't even think twice anymore if I'm gonna do yoga. It is a part of my routine. It is a part of something that I do every single day, and it's not even negotiable. Like, I just do it because it's just a habit at this point. It's just something that comes naturally. I don't have to force myself to do it. This is why it's so important to, even at the beginning, I felt really silly doing the yoga because I was like, oh, again, I was really self-conscious at the time, especially kind of body image wise. I was like, oh, I don't look like somebody who does yoga. I shouldn't be doing yoga. I don't have a proper yoga mat. I had like partial yoga mat type thing. And I felt really silly with how I did those things and how I looked. But I was like, no, I'm going to push forward. I'm going to try. And now I have come to the point where I can do some of the poses that I never thought that I could actually do or master. I have mastered them and I have increased my flexibility throughout it. But it's not because I did yoga for 5 days and then I was flexible. It has taken me 4 years, 3 or 4 years more or less, to reach this level where I can do more intermediate flows and advanced flows and actually do the poses that I once thought were totally out of my reach. And in general, throughout my days, how I sometimes think is that when I'm indecisive with something, I'm thinking, what would the best version of myself do, or what would the highest version of myself do, or however you want to word it, but it's pretty much the same thing. I'm thinking, how would that version of myself act? For example, I had just yesterday, I was thinking of going to the gym, but I had like a weird sore lower back for some reason. I think I'm not sure what happened there. And I was thinking like, oh, I should go to the gym because I promised myself that I'm going. But then I was like, if I have a sore lower back and I was planning on doing lower butt anyways, and these two are connected, I did feel a bit of soreness even just like walking and moving around. And I was like, but I promised myself that I was going to do it. And then I was like, wait a minute. The best version of myself would know better. She would know that it's important to rest. It's important to give my body rest. You don't have to push through and just force something. And I was able to kind of bring myself out of this like, oh, I promised myself yesterday that I'm going, so now I have to go. And instead be like, my body needs rest right now and I can give the rest now. I can do this workout on another day. It's not that critical. And another example that I can bring that kind of is relevant every now and then is that when I think about, for example, posting something online like social media or also this podcast in general, sometimes I get self-conscious about things. I'm like, should I post this? Is this too much? Yep. And then I'm like, wait. But the best version of myself wouldn't doubt myself twice because she believes in it. And even though it can be uncomfortable in the moment, in the long run, it will be beneficial. In the long run, it won't matter if I felt uncomfortable or scared for 5 minutes when making the post. Because, again, in the long run, it's all about building up that foundation and building up on it. It's one of my favorite thoughts is like, what would the best version of myself do or the highest version? Yep, whatever you want to call it. I always think when I'm indecisive, I go back to what would the best version of myself do? How would they react? Or even, how would they react? What would they do in this situation? How would they go from here? Because this version, it is you. It exists somewhere in you, but you just haven't reached that version yet. But by taking the steps and habits and acting as that best version of yourself, you will eventually become it. Because if you do something every day, for example, with my yoga or going for a walk, going for a run, whatever, if you do it every single day, it eventually just grows on you and it becomes natural, and you don't have to I don't want to say force it, but you don't have to put that much effort into doing it because it becomes naturally and it becomes a part of you. And here I also want to say that it's not necessarily fake it till you make it kind of a thing, because you're not really faking it, but you're just embodying it in a different way. And I feel like fake it till you make it, in depending on the situation, but it's also kind of more forceful, or that you're forcing yourself to do something. But these things should come naturally, but you shouldn't really actually have to force yourself to do something. These things, the best version of yourself things, they should also come naturally and flow naturally. And it should be like, oh, okay, my best version of self wants to do this. No, it's like, my best version of myself gets to do this and they are excited to do this, so I'm gonna do it right now as well, because I know that in the future, even though future in theory doesn't exist, but eventually when you're in that stage in your future, your present self in the future will be thankful for your current self, that she or he or they did something to move towards their goals or become that version of themselves. And this is where I would leave this topic for now, because I feel like there is a lot to think about and a lot to digest, and I don't want to overbear you with things. I do hope, because as my friend said as well, that this is something that gets him out of bed some mornings when he's like, oh, I don't want to get out of bed, I don't want to go study, or I don't want to go to work, or I don't want to do this or that. But then he has a click of like, but how will I become the best version of myself? To become that version of myself, I have to do those things. Because otherwise, you can just lay in your bed the whole day, but without making any progress, you're just pushing that best version of yourself more further and further away. So I hope that this episode, I hope it resonated, and just know that the best version of yourself already exists. It is already within you. But if you want to become a newer best version of yourself, you have to do more new things to reach that level. Yeah, you can just let me know. Again, always feedback is welcome. On my Instagram, you can just slide into my DMs. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.